She's going to have hard questions.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our first kitchen table talk for community gardeners of 2024. We'll be putting on a few of these. This is our off-season way of staying in touch and building some excitement for the gardening season. And no better way than to do that by talking about composting and all the planning that we can do as we head into early spring. My name is Joanna. I'm the Community Development Coordinator with the Calgary Horticultural Society, and I'm very happy to be here in the Alex Community Food Center where we're filming and helping to support and promote their gardening, their level ground gardening group and all the awesome things happening in their garden. And one of those was initial exploration into thermophilic composting, and we did that with our now good friends Tish and Colin. So I'd love to introduce our guests this evening, Tish Forteath and Colin Smith of the Calgary Compost Cooperative. You guys have a great presentation. I'm just gonna hand it over. Oh, I would love to do a land acknowledgement. I knew I was forgetting a very important piece. So we'll read our land acknowledgement and then over to you guys. So we respectfully acknowledge the enduring and active relationship of Indigenous people with this land, specifically the area in which we inhabit today, also known as the traditional territories of the people of Treaty 7, which include the Blackfoot Confederacy made up of the Siksika, Kainai, and Piikani nations, as well as the Wesley, Chiniki, and Bearspaw nations of the Yahi, Nakota, and the Tsuut'ina Nation. The Society as an organization is focused on the well-being of the land. We endeavor to honor Indigenous, Inuit, and Métis rights and relationships with the land, and the ability for all to grow, live, work, and play within this territory. So, thanks for that. And Tish and Colin, you guys want to take it away?
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. We've been meeting at Highfield Regenerative Farm, kind of created like a compost club of just compost enthusiasts and soil nerds that have been coming on Tuesday evenings. The last two growing seasons, it was through May to October about. And it started out with just a few people, and perhaps some people that are watching right now are maybe from the compost club. So hello if anybody is watching. We started out with a few, and we kind of grew quite quickly to about over a dozen every week. And I just think that goes to show how there's a real interest and a real desire for people to learn more about the soil and just how they can make their gardens better. And I think it's because people are looking for something positive to do for the earth. And when you come together and you make a pile, you feel like you're really making a difference. You're kind of co-creating with the microbes to feed the soil and then to feed the plants, which then feed us. So it's making healthy soil, plants, and humans. There's a whole lot of reasons to do it, but the main thing is we're trying to make living compost that supports a whole web of microbe characters. And yes, there's carbon sequestration and there's water retention that happens in the soil, which is all really important when we're thinking about climate change. But I think for some of us, a lot of, like for me especially, for me it was more of a personal journey, and it started actually with like health issues and gut issues. And I first started learning about like my gut microbiome, and I was like, oh, I didn't realize that existed, and oh, that's why I'm having gut problems. And then so I went through all these, having allergies to different types of food, and then it all kind of climaxed in 2017. My appendix exploded, and for about 3 months I had this big abscess, and they kept trying to drain it before they wanted to do a surgery. And so during that time I felt like a compost pile. And so for me that's kind of why I feel this maybe kind of kinship to compost, or this passion for compost. And I think if we were to ask people, like just even on Zoom, there's probably a lot of people that have had health issues related to the gut, or they know somebody with those kind of issues. And for me, I don't know, just that happened to me the one year, and then the following year my mother had her large intestine taken out because of colitis, and she's been battling that forever. So just all these things, and I think, the number of people I've heard that are having that operation and stuff, it just shouldn't be happening. Something's wrong with our whole system, our whole food system, and the way we've been eating. So yeah, that's why I'm here and why I'm passionate about it. And so I don't have any kind of science background, and I wouldn't say that we're experts or anything. We've just been on this journey and learning, and I'm sure that we'll learn a lot from the people that are in the audience, and that they have a lot of knowledge to pass on also. But I think you don't have to be an expert to start healing the earth and each other. So yeah, and maybe.
And I can introduce myself while we're waiting.
Sure.
Or my story, I guess. Mine's more of a family legacy. My grandparents have always composted, and my parents composted, and I had an epiphany many years ago helping my mom dig out her static compost pile, of which my grandfather built like the frame for, and we dug out the bottom, and the smell and the richness of the compost, the black gold at the bottom was just like, wow. I can't explain it. It was just like a big moment of like, I love compost. And I've been, I guess, digging into my family history a bit more, and lots of many generations of farming. And so I don't know, maybe there's a connection there. And then over the last few years, I found old tools of my grandfather's, like hand tools, like for chopping weeds for compost, and old compost bins, and then me and Tish connected over the Soil Food Web school. We were both students, and came on it from different angles, but I don't know, we're compost companions now, or compost friends, and learning a lot in the process. So we're here to share a bit about what we've learned. So I'll pass it back to Tish.
Okay. Well, basically, I think when you come to compost, it's very much a sensory experience. You might notice the smells. That's the first thing that might hit people, or be, oh, it doesn't smell bad, or oh, this smells like a barn, depending on how successful the pile is going. So yeah, it involves all your senses. And lately I was reading a book called An Immense World, and it talks about the different perceptual worlds of animals and insects and different creatures. And it really hit me, and I love kind of thinking about it, that each living creature has its own Umwelt, which is like this German word, I guess, because it was a scientist that was talking about this, a German scientist, but it's a perceptual world, unique for its survival and purpose. And so if you think of like a tick, which is something that we normally think of as scary and don't try to avoid, a tick questing for mammalian blood cares about body heat, the touch of hair, and the odor of butyric acid that emanates from the skin. So there's only like 3 things that its sensory world is just about, those 3 things. And that's all it needs to survive, because that's how it will get its food and find blood. So to me, when I think about that, like there's another quote that hit me from that was, nothing can sense everything and nothing needs to. It's also why contemplating the perceptual world of another creature is so deeply human and so utterly profound. Our senses filter in what we need, and we must choose to learn the rest. So I think we're really lucky as humans that we are able to observe nature and then observe other creatures. And I think the more we observe, we realize that we're quite connected. And for me, I think in my journey of learning about compost, sometimes you might get really worked up about worrying about having the right percentage, or is this the right carbon to nitrogen percentage, and you might get worried about the details. But for me, I think if you start to think about why you're making the compost pile and the microbes. So if you learn about the microbes, then I think it'll just be natural that you'll know how to make good compost and good soil, because you'll start to understand what they are looking for, what's important to them. And for my mind, it's easier to think that way than to think about chemical or carbon and nitrogen. It's easier for me to think about the creatures. But yeah, so the next screen here. So starting with that, if we were in person, I would have, I'd give you little cards and I'd maybe say, you're a bacteria or you're a nematode. What do you think you eat? So we're just gonna, since we're on Zoom, we're gonna go through just a few slides, and I want you to think as if you are this creature. What would you be looking for, and what would make you happy? So you can see here on the slide, we have like the three main types of bacteria. And generally, as soil food web students that we've been studying the microscope and stuff, when we look through the microscope, we're not too worried if we see the bacilli or the cocci, but if we see the spirilla, then we might get a little bit worried. They're the ones that are like a corkscrew, or they move like a snake. You might think of like, I think like Lyme disease belongs to the spirochete family. So some of the pathogens for humans. And so that's when we get concerned. But so in this picture here, it's just a picture from a compost pile that we had. You'll see we mainly see a lot of the round cocci, and sometimes the bacilli. So you can see that here. And then when we actually have a compost pile, if we see, it's called actinobacteria. It's the white, ashy look in a compost pile. And that happens when a pile heats up, and then maybe the bacteria get so excited that they use up all the oxygen, and it leaves, so actinobacteria, they don't like a lot of oxygen. They don't need a lot of oxygen. They're kind of what we call facultative bacteria. And so they're an indicator that, oh, this pile needs to be turned. So I don't know how many people have piles at home. Maybe you've checked in your backyard and you might see this white ashy, if it's heated up, you might see this kind of white ashy, looks like ashes. And so then you'll know, oh, okay, I should mix my pile because it needs more air. Yeah, and then under the mic, oh, there, yeah. So what type of food do bacteria like? Generally, they're looking for root exudates, which is a large picture of a root exudate there. You can just see, it's kind of cool, off the tip of a root. And the more we learn about bacteria, we realize that they have this really intimate relationship with roots. Sometimes they're taken up into the root, sometimes they're on the surface, but they're all exchanging nutrients. And when you think of making compost, if you think of what ingredients are important, you think of, we use brewing grains. That's our like really high nitrogen to get the heat going. And coffee grounds are also, and any kind of greens. Bacteria loves to eat greens. So, yeah, and then one other important thing I just want to mention about bacteria, the reason the pile heats up when we put all these ingredients together is because the bacteria start to reproduce. It's like a big party. And they reproduce, they just, by binary fission, they create another kind of like a clone of themselves. And so all the nutrients that they're taking from the food, it's kind of just stays in them. And then when they create another bacteria, it'll go into the other bacteria. And it's not really being pooped out so much. So it's important that they're eaten by other creatures in order to release those nutrients. So anyway, I'm talking a lot about bacteria, and I think we're on to fungi. So, oh, and now I did want to mention one thing. If you look at, there's a good quote in Teaming with Microbes, which is a really good book. They say, how many bacteria do you think you have in a tablespoon of compost? And we say it's about 1 billion in a tablespoon of compost. And then for fungi, if you had to guess how many meters of fungi, and so it's kind of, I don't know, some people say like 1,000 or just a couple meters. They say about 300 meters of fungi. And so in the compost piles, we often get the saprophytic fungi that start to come up, and the fruiting bodies come up, and have like inky caps come up, which are always fun to see. And that's like one of my favorite things about making compost is when the mushrooms start to pop up, normally about after 3 or 4 weeks of making a pile. And then sometimes some mushrooms or some fungi, you don't see any fruiting bodies. They're just in the soil and you don't even know that they're there. And so they are like the bacteria. They like to eat the root exudates, and And their decomposers also like the bacteria, so they'll decompose leaves and wood. And then a lot of people know about mycorrhizal fungi. A lot of people have been learning about that. How trees actually can share nutrients just going through the fungi underground. And it's not just trees; it's other plants too in the soil that have this way of connecting through the mycorrhizal fungi that's in the ground. And so on the top corner, you see some wood chips. You might find that just in a pile of wood chips on the ground if you're looking, and that's the saprophytic fungi that's starting to decompose the wood chips. Or even on a log. That one log was by our compost club that has all the mycelium going out, and it's kind of cool to see. So I think we'll go on to the next. Then we also have come across amoebas. So the protozoas, amoeba is a part of the protozoa category of microbes. And they're important because they release the nutrients. Like I said, the bacteria, maybe they all have it in them, but then amoeba will come along and eat it. And when it eats it, then it's able to poop out the nutrients. And bacteria are really good for making like nitrates and nitrites in the soil. Like if you think of regular fertilizer, it's more like a nitrate. Whereas the protozoa, they'll be pooping out more ammonium type of nitrogen. And we have two basic types of amoeba. You kind of can think of them like a snail and a slug, maybe. Like I think of the ones that have a shell are the testate amoeba, and you can see that in the picture. And they'll kind of stay in their shell and bring nutrients in. And then they have ones that don't have a shell, and it's like a naked amoeba. And you can see the picture on the screen here, and it's very sci-fi. It's kind of cool to watch them because they come and engulf their food, and then it's very fascinating to watch them for hours. and yeah, they're all important for the cycling of nutrients. And you can see at the bottom, when the conditions aren't right, if it's too dry or too hot, they'll form cysts. And sometimes it's just a round circle with a double wall, and sometimes they're very ornate. Again, you might think of like if you go scuba diving, it's almost like going scuba diving when you look through the microscope. Because, yeah, you see like ornate, almost like shells on the outside. We can go on to the next. And then there's other protozoa. There's flagellates, which have a flagella, and they tend to go like a bumblebee kind of in the soil. And they're very small, and they're positive to see. And then there's ciliates. And ciliates, you don't want to see a lot of them because they're kind of like the actinobacteria. If you see a lot of them, you know your pile doesn't have enough oxygen. So then you need it because they're kind of more in water environments. And I love this one because it kind of moves like a dolphin to me at the end here, the way it swims. And they have like cilia all the way around them. And one of these will maybe eat like 10,000 bacteria in a day. And then their poop is just in the right form for plants to take up. So very important characters to have in the soil. And then there's the nematodes. And perhaps these are easier to understand because you can almost see them with your naked eye. Sometimes they're like 0.5 millimeter long. So if you were to look really closely, you could probably see them. And I came across this one night, and it was so funny because I couldn't believe it. I'm like, oh, are they having sex? I think they're having sex. and yeah, they are, but they don't stop eating. So I think of them like the multitaskers. They can have sex and keep on eating. And so they're fun to watch, and they're like blind roundworms. And there's different types. And so a lot of times people would think, oh, nematodes are bad. I don't want any nematodes in my soil. And maybe it's because they're thinking of the root-feeding nematodes. So the root-feeding ones, they have big spears. It's actually the third one on the slide. You can see it has these big muscles, these knobs at the bottom of the spear. And that's so it can poke a root and get all the nutrients out. And then the first one, A, is actually a bacteria feeding. And when we look at compost piles, we see a lot of those. Those are the main ones. Just because of the state that our piles are in, they start out being very bacterial dominated. until they get older and age, then they become more fungal. And they often have fancy lips, and they don't have any spear. The second one, the B, you can see it has a really fine spear, and that's for fungi. And so it doesn't need to have as big a spear, and you don't see the muscles as much. But so hit fungi. And then D is predator. So I don't know if any of you have had problems with root feeding nematodes, but you can buy predator nematodes that will eat them. So it will eat other nematodes. So you have like a whole predator prey thing happening in your soil. It's cool. And the last one is kind of an omnivore. It has a spear. Maybe it'll eat some fungi. Maybe it'll eat some bacteria. So yeah, they're really cool. So we look at them under the microscope and see what we have. They're good to have in your soil. And then, of course, there's all the things that we can see or that are more visible to the eye. The earthworms, which are always good, and the birds that will carry different bacteria or mites maybe on their feathers without even realizing it, and spores and seeds to different locations. And yeah, other little arthropods. And they're all just in this web of life that's all happening under our feet and very much alive. And so it's quite exciting. And here, I don't know if people are all familiar with this picture of the soil food web. I think for me, a lot of things, like we've talked a lot about the different creatures, but also recognizing the plants. The plants are the producers. And there was one regenerative agriculture rancher that I heard give a short talk, and he was very poetic and it was beautiful. And he said something that I found quite profound. He said plants are like the connection between heaven and earth, because they're harvesting the sun, they're getting their energy from the sun, the water, they have water, air, and the sun, and they photosynthesize. And then they're also getting the microbes from the earth, and they're just this bridge between heaven and earth. And for me, it was just like, oh, it was such a beautiful way of thinking about it. And so, yeah, and then you can see how they all fit in. The bacteria and the fungi are the decomposers, and they are the consumers also. And then you have the nematodes, the protozoa, and the other arthropods, all more the consumers as you go up the levels to larger animals. And so the plants produce sugars, and then the microbes like to eat those sugars, so they'll come to the roots. Or we're finding out now that they're on the leaves, they're on everything. The plant's always putting out exudates, putting out sugars. And next. And so, yeah, once you start to realize there's this whole web of life under your feet, and you come to realize that it really is all about the poop loop. And I don't know, for so many years we've all tried to be so sanitary and so clean, but really poop is a very important factor in the whole cycle of life. And you don't really need to have the fertilizers or the pesticides. If you have the right harmony going on in your soil food web, that poop will provide the nutrients that's just the right amounts for the plant. You're not going to be putting too much nitrogen or the wrong kind of nitrogen. It'll just be the right amount. And same for the other trace minerals. You don't have to worry about applying exactly the right amount. Yeah, Colin.
Thanks, Tish. A friend of mine, before I even found out about the soil food web, said poo is the glue. If you can talk to your friends about poop, then you know you're really good friends. And poop is what holds the soil food web together. That's essentially nutrient cycling. Thank you for talking about all the different characters in the soil food web. I'm now going to talk about some of the more specifics of hot composting. And we're going to talk specifically about the soil food web method, which is a method that is used to essentially get really consistent results in a compost pile. So consistent temperatures, consistent mixing and materials, and essentially a really high quality biocomplete. That's another term for having all of the different characters in the compost pile. Is you want all those characters to be there so that the nutrient cycling can happen once you put this compost on your soil. So first, I'm going to talk about compost or the equipment that you need to do this method. So this might be new to all of you, and I'll just plug that me and Tish and our community are operate under this cooperative called Calgary Compost Cooperative, and we also use the term Compost Club. We've been hosting the Compost Club at Highfield Farm over the past couple of years, in the summer times at least, and we're looking to activate compost clubs around the city at other community gardens and other community spaces. So tonight we're here at the Alex, and we did a compost education session with the hope of a compost club happening here in the future. Anyway, all that to say is, if you have any questions about this, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. The email to get in touch with us is hello@compostclub.ca, and I think we'll put that in the chat. But hello@compostclub.ca. We're covering a lot of information tonight, so get in touch with us. Come learn hands-on, or if you want to do this yourself in your own backyard and have questions, we're happy to answer them. So the compost equipment needed are, you can see in the picture on the slide, is a mesh ring. So we use a 1/2-inch mesh. We've tried a few different meshes, but this one keeps the least amount of material falling out. You can use other meshes, they still work, but you'll have a lot of overs or things that kind of fall out of the pile. But we found this 1/2-inch mesh is pretty readily available. You can get it at Home Depot, though you want to get 10-foot lengths minimum. So I think Home Depot and hardware, like regular hardware stores, sell a 5-foot length, and that's too short to make a full ring. You need 10 feet. And the picture here, I think, is a 4-foot height. But we recommend a 3-foot height, because you have to essentially dig it into the mesh, like dig the material out to turn it. And if it's 4 feet, it's quite hard to get over that. At 3 feet, for most average size humans, you can stand on the ground or on the pallet and bend over. And the 3-foot is kind of at waist height. So we recommend 2 mesh rings made out of 3-foot tall by 10-foot long, 1/2-inch, what's also known as hardware cloth. I'll just plug a Canadian distributor called Greg's Distributors. They sell larger rolls of this stuff. But another plug for the Compost Cooperative is we have pre-made rings, and we're happy to save you some of the guesswork out of building these yourselves, and we will sell you these at essentially cost, as well as some of the other equipment that I'm going to go over. So you have 2 rings, one to build your compost in, and then the second ring is there empty for turning the compost into, so you're essentially going back and forth between the 2 rings as you turn your compost pile. The next thing you're going to need is 2 pallets for these rings to sit on, and the pallets are also covered with a 4x4 square of mesh. Pallets are easy to find, and the mesh just keeps the material from falling through the larger places on the pallet. You essentially have 2 pallets with rings on them, and you're kind of moving the material back and forth. We'll talk about the specifics of turning here a bit later. You'll need a tarp, ideally approximately 9-foot by 12-foot tarp to wrap the pile in. This keeps the moisture in, and a key part of good composting is the right moisture level. And we found in Calgary's hot and dry summers, piles can dry out all around the edges quite quickly, and we want to maintain a consistent amount of moisture, so the tarp just helps keep the sun off and the moisture in. You'll need a couple bungee cords to kind of secure the tarp. We've also found bike tubes, like a deflated bike tire is a good size to wrap around the ring and hold the tarp on. And then you're going to want 40 to 50 buckets, depending on the size of pile that you're making. So this is another item that the Compost Cooperative can help you, secure or even lend you or sell you. There are different, not lots, but people we know have different stashes and sources used buckets from around the city, and it's part of kind of the composting mentality is trying to reuse and recycle things. So a lot of food or restaurants use buckets that they can't necessarily reuse or send back to the manufacturer. So but you need buckets to essentially measure out all the material you're going to put in your compost, and the buckets allow you to have a nice recipe. It's essentially like, when you have a recipe, you can know the measurements that you're putting in. You're going to want a couple lids for these buckets with holes in them, drilled in them. This is just because you have to soak the material, some of the woody material, and then you just put the lid on with the holes and tip it upside down to drain out the excess water. And then you're going to want a compost thermometer. There's different varieties, but the cheapest and most economical one we found is sold at Lee Valley for approximately $40. You can spend a lot more on compost thermometers, but we would recommend Lee Valley. And then you just need some hand tools like pitchforks and rakes to manipulate the material. So we'll go on to the next slide, and I'm going to give you a basic recipe for a 40 bucket pile. So just a quick note here about pile size. For the hot composting method, you want a minimum pile size in order to retain heat and have enough essentially mass to keep the hot composting process going. And just imagine your average size bucket, like a 5-gallon or a 4-gallon bucket. These are the bucket sizes that we're talking about. And you don't really want to make a smaller pile than a 40 bucket pile when you're doing the hot composting method. Another note I'll say is, we'll probably answer this in more detail, but this type of method, we wouldn't recommend using your earth machine, your black composter, or any other of the kind of manufactured composting apparatuses out there. This is specific to the circular mesh ring. Anyway, so the minimum size you want to do is a 40 bucket pile, but in the 3-foot, 10-foot mesh ring that I've described, you can get up to a 50 bucket pile. And then if you have a longer length than 10 feet, you can make a wider ring, like say a 12-foot length of mesh, and you can do up to a 60 bucket pile. But 60 buckets is a lot of material, but if you have it, then you can do that. So I'm going to describe this recipe in 10 buckets. That way we can think about it in percentages. And then for a 40 bucket pile, you will just have 4 rows of 10 buckets. And that's kind of how we lay it. That is how we lay it out at Compost Club. It's visually, organized, and you can see how many buckets of each type you have in each row. And then you match up all the rows, and you know that you have a consistent recipe. So for every row of 10 buckets, we have 60% wood chips, or 6 buckets of wood chips. There's possible substitutions, or another good part or thing to think about for good compost is diversity of materials. So we'll say 6 buckets of woody materials, but that could be wood chips, it could be leaves, it could be spent mushroom substrate, failed dried up compost that you have in your earth machine that hasn't composted over the years. And having a mix of those materials is your best bet. And so these are the fungal foods, and I'll talk a bit more about them in a bit. But yeah, diversity is good. So 60% wood chips, and then 30% green materials. And we consistently recommend coffee grounds as a easily attainable green material, and usually very consistent, and is great for its surface area and its green material purposes, and I'll talk more about that in a second. But yeah, you don't want to use all 30% coffee grounds. That's too much small surface area and not enough diversity. So we recommend 1 bucket of coffee grounds in each 10 bucket row. So in a 40 bucket pile, that would be 4 buckets of coffee grounds. And then in each 10 bucket row, 2 buckets of greens. So for a 40 bucket pile, 2 times 4 rows is 8 buckets of greens. And this is ideally vegetable scraps from your kitchen, green waste like lawn clippings, not too many lawn clippings because they tend to bulk together. Green leaves, just weeds and like clippings and trimmings from your garden. Yeah, any green material. I'll talk about that a little bit more. And then 10% or 1 bucket in your 10 bucket row of brewing grains. This is another easily attainable material here in Calgary with all of the craft breweries that have popped up over the years. It is a consistent source that we've had great success with as our high nitrogen material. And this is what really kicks off the bacterial party to get them all to reproduce and create that heat. Yeah, and then the last kind of part of the recipe is good water. So I'm sure we've all know that, or maybe we don't, but the city of Calgary water is treated with chlorine in order to keep the drinking water system safe, all the pipes clean and free of bacteria. The chlorine is an anti-microbial additive to our water. It's not necessarily harmful to human health, but if we use water straight out of the tap, it will affect the microbes that we want to have in our pile. So we want to make sure this is chlorine-free water. And the way to do that is let this water sit out for 24 hours or so, or add a humic acid powder, which is another thing that the Calgary Compost Cooperative can hook you up with. You could buy a bag of it from a garden center or another source, but you'll have enough humic acid for a lifetime. So you only need, a pill container size amount for multiple. Yeah, this bag of humic acid I've had for 3 years, and we've pretty much used it in every pile that we've made, and there's still a lot of it here. So we'd happily share that with you. Yeah, and as you can see, it's been through the ringer. But when you put that in chlorine water or tap water straight out of the tap, it essentially is a very complex carbon molecule, and it's like a carbon filter in a Brita. It'll lock up all of the chlorine pretty much immediately, and it will keep it away from the microbes. And it's also like a microbial and fungal food, so it's another diversity thing to add to your compost. So that's the overview of the recipe. I hope that made sense. I'm going to talk a bit more specifically about the different materials. So green materials are 30%. Overall, you want about 30% of green materials in your pile. And this can, vary a little bit. If it's, peak summer, you could maybe go with, well, I shouldn't say that. Let's just say 30%. Keep it simple. 30% is a good amount of green materials. And this is where diversity is also very helpful. So if you had, some trimmings of weeds or plants from your garden, your neighbor mowed their grass because you don't have grass. You've taken out your lawn hopefully, and you're just growing, flowers and native grasses and not mowing them. But yeah, you get diverse materials. I'll just note, make sure your neighbor's not spraying pesticides or any sort of herbicides on that grass, because then that grass would have the same effect as the chlorine would and affect the microbial life in your pile. So you want clean, pesticide-free greens, and diverse sources. Great additions to compost are yarrow, comfrey, all those kind of buckwheat, different plants that lock up and have dandelions, another one. And I should say that this composting method, if we do it correctly, reaches temperatures that will kill weed seeds and kill the pathogens in the pile. So we've done some testing with our piles and haven't had too many weed seeds or haven't had evidence of weed seeds surviving. But yeah, you would, for a 40 bucket pile, you would want, if you're using the coffee grounds, 30% of a 40 bucket pile is 12 buckets. And it's quite hard to find that many greens. So at Compost Club, Highfield Farm, we had a lot of weeding done regularly and, pulling up large invasive plants. That's another good source of greens, like the mugwort, creeping bellflower. What other ones have we used? I don't know, all sorts of weeds. Yeah, Canadian thistle. But the key is you have to chop it up finely. You can't put large, just straight up weeds. You have to chop them up. And so that's when many hands make light work at Compost Club. To do it all yourself, it is possible. We also have rigged up a lawnmower to just have all the weeds on a piece of plywood or on a surface and just mow them is a good technique for chopping up the weeds, or greens, I should say. And yeah, then like I said, coffee grounds are a good green material. Yeah, and the woody brown material. So this is the fungal food. This also acts as a bulking agent and holds moisture in the compost pile. And this is what you need the most of. And Highfield Farm has an abundance of wood chips. If you get in touch with us, we can facilitate a collection of wood chips for you for your compost pile. But there's also other sources. Other good brown materials to include in your pile are leaves and non-green kind of material from your yard. Things from maybe the year before, or leaves are great, especially if they're old leaves and they've got like leaf mold on them and all sorts of different things growing. Other things that you could potentially come across are mushroom substrate, paper and cardboard. We don't use that too much, but it is possible. And finished or failed previous composts. So these are the foods that are going to feed the fungi in the pile. They're not going to really have any real active process in the early stages of the thermophilic process, but they create air pockets and retain water. And once the pile has gone through its thermophilic phase and it cools down, this is where the fungi come to life. And when we see fungi growing on the pile, and they're good wood chips will make good compost. Next slide. So next is high nitrogen materials. And this is so in the thermophilic composting method, it's all about hitting certain temperature thresholds, a minimum 55 degrees for a certain period of time, essentially 3 times, which we'll talk a bit about how we turn the pile. But this is the material that helps get those temperatures up. So essentially these materials are feeding the bacteria that reproduce at a high enough rate to essentially generate heat and kill pathogens and kill weed seeds in your compost. So we consistently use brewing grains. Highfield Farm is just down the street from Village Brewery, and we collect fresh brewing grains every time we make a pile. This is 10% of your pile. And like I said, there's lots of craft breweries, so it's easy to find this food or this resource in Calgary. We just suggest you talk to the brewery closest to your house and ask them in advance if you can collect some of this material. Other potential, what we call high nitrogen or party foods, because it gets the bacterial party started, are manure, ideally fresh manure that's ideally as pure as possible to be that high nitrogen. If there's bedding mixed in, then you might need to adjust the recipe to be, say, 15 or 20% high nitrogen instead of the 10% that we recommend. And then we haven't really used the fish hydrolysate or meat. That would be in more commercial operations, but both those have high nitrogen content. And then in times where haven't been hitting our temperature thresholds, we've been told to use blood meal, but we haven't really experimented with that yet.
Too scared.
Apparently it doesn't take much to get it going, because essentially blood meal is straight nitrogen. That's the overview of the materials, and then just a note on the water. So we suggest hydrating the wood chips for 24 hours and allowing them to absorb as much water as possible, draining off the excess, and then when we mixed all the materials together, you want to have 50% saturation or 50% water content, which is the way that we test it is by taking a handful of that material and squeezing it as hard as you can. And if you get 1 or 2 drops, you're at 50% moisture. If you get a lot of drops, it's too wet, or it's 60 to 70% moisture, and you're going to have to add something to absorb or take out that water. Or if you're getting no drops, you have to add water. and you want to maintain that moisture throughout the whole thermophilic process. Yeah, next slide. So just a note on oxygen levels, so we've gone over the materials. So you want good, diverse materials for your compost pile. You want good water at approximately 50%, and then you want oxygen. And oxygen, those are the three key ingredients to good compost. And why we want oxygen is because all of good soils and plant roots essentially need oxygenated soils. There's no plants that we want to grow that are technically anaerobic. Maybe if you have a wetland or a pond, but anaerobic bacteria and microbes are not what we want in our soil. We want aerobic or oxygenated microbes in our soil. So when the party is happening and all those microbes are reproducing, as Tish mentioned, that you can get actinobacteria or low oxygen conditions, and that's why we have to turn our pile. We never want our pile to go anaerobic. And signs that it's gone anaerobic are bad smells and, essentially pretty much just bad smells. And good oxygenated compost shouldn't smell bad. So this little chart just shows that the different kind of areas that oxygen content. So we have oxygenated at the top, or the 3 rows, and then low oxygen in the middle, and then essentially no oxygen or anaerobic at the bottom. And all the bad stuff we don't want grows in anaerobic, and all the good stuff that we do want grows in aerobic. And our compost can handle a little bit of the low oxygen, but we never want it to go fully anaerobic, and that usually happens in the middle, and you can monitor that with temperature and smell. And based on those factors, that's when you turn it. But I won't go into any more detail on that. I'll go to the next slide. So now it's the party time. So this is when we essentially mix it all together and it starts to cook or heat up. And so once you mix your recipe together, we like to do it on a tarp, every 10 buckets at a time on the tarp. Mix it all together and then put it in the mesh, and just do that for every 10 buckets that you have. And once you do that, within 24 to 48 hours, the pile should start to heat up if you've done it right. And it should keep heating up until 55 and probably go beyond that. But you essentially want to start a clock once it hits 55, and you want it to be there you want to turn it after 72 hours. But then there's another threshold of 65 degrees Celsius, and that's once it hits that, you need to turn it in a shorter amount of time because the oxygen is being used up. And if it hits 70 to 75 degrees Celsius, you want to essentially turn it that day because at those temperatures, the oxygen is getting used up really fast by all those microbes, and it'll essentially be used up and go anaerobic. So yeah, this is what we get the most questions about. But yeah, and then so those temperatures are only in the center of the pile. Not the bottom and not the sides. So there's a very somewhat specific way of turning where we take the top off and put it on a tarp, and then we take the middle out, which has been cooked and has reached that temperature threshold, and we put it on the bottom of the next turn. And then we take what was on the top, which is usually nice and warm and almost at 55 or almost at that temperature threshold, and we put it in the middle. And that's going to be the new hot center. And then we take the bottom and put it on the top. And we do that 3 times at these temperature thresholds, and then you can essentially say that your compost pile all the material has been through those temperature thresholds. So weed seeds and harmful bacteria should be killed, but you might still have to turn it in that method additional times to allow the nitrogen to burn off and it to start to cool down. So yeah, I'm going to pass it back to Tish to talk about plant succession.
Okay. And in that previous picture too, you could see Ruth, who's part of the compost club. It was kind of like a nest you make too. I was going to mention, like, you have your dome and then you have your egg in the middle, and then the nest at the bottom when you're turning.
Yeah. So Ruth has dug out the hot center there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
And sometimes that can be too hot to touch.
Yes. So going back to like why we're doing this is because with conventional farming methods and a lot of the dirt that we just have, it's mainly bacteria dominated. A lot of the slides I showed you at the beginning had all these creatures in it, but often people will bring their garden soil and they'll be, oh, I love my garden soil. and we'll look under the microscope and it's just bacteria maybe, or if it's just from the street, there's maybe hardly anything in it, just some minerals and not very much organic matter. It was, for me, when I started taking the soil food web classes, this was all new information to me, and it was just kind of mind-blowing. So that's why we like to include it in our presentations, is that when you see something like just rocks, and then as you go up to maybe like an area with weeds, maybe the side of a road, it all has to do with how much bacteria to fungi are in the soil. So when you don't have very many plants, you'll have is maybe more bacterial dominated, and weeds will grow there because they don't put a lot of energy down into the soil. All their energy is put up into their seeds because they disperse those seeds and everything stays more on the surface. And then as you go along, if you start thinking about your flowers and your garden, you want to have more fungi because more energy is going down into the roots. So a typical garden, you might want to have like a ratio of 0.7. My mind's going blank all of a sudden. But anyway, you want to increase the fungi, and then like a crop like wheat or something or corn, it's almost a 1-to-1. And so gardening is just a little bit less. You don't need as much fungi. And then as you progress up to an ancient forest, then you'll get maybe like really high numbers. Like the fungal bacteria might be 300-to-1. And again, if you think about trees, they have these long roots, hopefully, if the ground, it depends on if it's a rocky surface, obviously. But the roots will go deep. 80% of their energy is going into the soil, and that's how they're communicating and they're shifting nutrients around. Everything's happening a lot under the ground. So then you'll see that. And for me, another thing that was, so when people say, like if they look at their garden, they say, oh, I just keep on getting weeds. I don't know why I get so many weeds. And you start to think like this, you'll be like, oh yeah, it's because you have bacteria and your plants aren't getting all the nutrients they need. Because in bacteria-dominated soils, it's more nitrate form of nitrogen. And that's maybe like our fertilizers that we've been using, all our chemical fertilizers, they're more nitrate. Whereas when you go towards fungi, it's more ammonium. And like I said, the gardens and our crops, they like a balance of both, a little bit of both. And so the protozoa and the other microbes, they poop out a lot of ammonium. And then it's the bacteria that will often change it back into nitrate form. So we need both, and we just need them to be in right balance. And then, I mean, it's great to make compost and everything, but you also have to have the soil health principles. And I think as in the last couple of years when we've been making compost at different locations, I think that's what kind of makes it or breaks it as far as the compost. You might make really great compost and then you give it to somebody and they just kind of scatter it on their soil. I'm guilty of doing this, even though I say it. And I'll just maybe scatter it out, and I hope that maybe they'll cover it with some kind of straw or something, and maybe it doesn't get covered. And basically, the UV rays from the sun or the wind, it will kill the microbes also. But if you have the soil health principles, where you have like soil armor, you keep the ground covered, and if possible, you can have a continual live plant root. Also, maybe some perennials all year round. Plant diversity, more diversity is always better. You get more microbes, different things happening. And then minimize the soil disturbance. So, trying not to dig very much. Maybe if you have really bad soil, you have to do an initial bit of digging just to break it up because it's compacted, and then try to get your compost in there. But then after that, if you can minimize it. And then also like no disturbance with chemicals too. Try not to use the pesticides and the really strong fertilizers. And then if you have any kind of livestock integration, maybe it's chickens or cattle or goats, or if you're in the city, maybe it's just the rabbit that comes hopping by or the squirrels. That is all part of what makes the whole system happen. And these are just some kind of resources that we like. Yeah, so we don't have everything on that slide. We brought some of the books. Teaming with microbes, if some people are really keen on the soil food web, a school, Dr. Lean Ingham's school, which is what we've been taking our classes through. But maybe it's too much of a commitment or too expensive. And if you want to kind of just know basically what's in the course, this Teaming with Microbes book, he covers a lot of what you learn in the course. So I'd say that's a really good place to start.
It's available at the public library. There's a couple
Yeah.
copies.
Yeah, and he has a whole series. He has Teaming with Nutrients, which is kind of over my head, but it's at the library. This is from the library.
Teaming with fungi. They kind of basic, medium, and then like very
This is
detailed.
very-
But this is the book you should start
And
with.
there's also Teaming with Bacteria
Yeah.
now. And he's coming out with more and more, it seems. But yeah, and then another good book I just came across, and I got this at Christmas, so I haven't had a chance to really look at it a lot. But there's a guy named Matt Powers who kind of just looked all over the internet and gathered all the information about soil health. So he has one book that's kind of about regenerative agriculture, soil practices, and that's where kind of his big umbrella of this is what's going on right now with soil health. And then he has one on microscopy, and I love this for the pictures. So I just thought it's kind of useful to have, if we don't have a microscope, you can just open it up and say, hey, this is what this looks like. And if you are looking through a microscope, Matt Powers, so he's a guy to check out. And there's some podcasts we had on there.
Yeah,
There's
right there.
In Search of Soil, really great podcasts with lots of interesting information. And also John Kemp, I don't see it right now on there. He has a regenerative ag podcast, and I'm always learning stuff from him and the guests that he has on there. Living Web Farms, they have lots of, you can see them do their microscope work. They have lots of informational stuff. And then Finding the Mother Tree in Entangled Life, it's more about fungi. And a lot of people are familiar with Finding the Mother Tree, I think now, Suzanne Simard. And yeah, just interesting books, kind of more interest. Oh, right, and then Nicole Masters is also another good person to learn from.
Yeah, I'll just. I think you gotta click send.
I'm not gonna.
Oh no, sorry. This is a growing field of discovery. I think soil science was maybe intuited by people that come before us, and probably since time immemorial in a way. But now with the microscope and other tools, we're actually being able to see it. And it's only now just being researched. Compost is magic. You essentially work with microbes and bacteria to break things down. There's lots of philosophical parallels to the whole thing, but now it's being backed up with science and tools of science like microscopes and things like that to validate and verify. But it's still a very new field. Pretty much every day there's new things being discovered, and that's why so many of those podcasts are interesting, because you're kind of on the cutting edge. But yeah, compost is life, and we hope we provided some inspiration and things tonight.
Yeah, you sure did. My head is going to explode, but sometimes I think, because we spend some time learning together over the pile, and having the opportunity to basically walk through your presentation step by step in person, and then use our hands so our heads don't explode too much was the best experience ever. When I think about folks that are in our audience, I know, first of all, thank you so much for being with us in person and online tonight. We look forward to learning alongside you guys, and tapping into all of the nerdiness that you're accumulating, because it really is new, old knowledge that we can apply now. And off the top, Tish, what you said about composting and looking to the soil for hope, and like an active hope, like where we're engaged and we're doing something to change it, and be invested in our surroundings and the ground below our feet, just like you both said, is really encouraging. And I know we've got our kitchen table talks are mostly geared towards community gardeners. So I know a lot of folks in the audience tonight are gardening in spaces that aren't just their home garden or their backyard. and we have community members who garden maybe on a balcony or no yard or with groups in different settings. So I'll ask questions so we start to see some come in, and if folks want to comment or share questions in the chat, we can read them out as we go. We've got about 20 minutes, so if people have burning questions, toss them at our hot composters. But for me, when I think about, like, if I know a little bit, I don't know, this is my first introduction to composting. I'm really stoked on doing this. And I don't have a huge budget because I'm working in a community garden space, and we haven't written a lot of grants yet. What kind of things should I, like, how do I start? How do I, like, do I have to take the Soil Food Web school? Do I, like, what should I think about if I've got a 4x8 spot in my community garden, but there's nothing else going on compost wise? Like, what would be a good recommendation for a first step?
You could just try like doing the static pile too, like,
Yeah.
and then just layering like the browns and the greens, and then if you notice some of these things that we've been mentioning, like the actinobacteria, or if it smells bad, then you want to keep the moisture. So a lot of the things that we mentioned that we do for hot composting can be applied to static piles. But then also, it really isn't that expensive to get like a pallet that's free. The mesh is your most important, most expensive probably piece of material. And so if you're okay with just, learning from some, like just as tonight's presentation, I think you have enough information. You could go out and make your own pile.
So follow that recipe.
Yeah.
Get the basic equipment and follow that recipe.
Yeah.
I'd say talk to your fellow community gardeners.
Yeah.
We've really noticed, or like I started, doing this on my own in my own backyard, and it's a lot of work to make a hot composting pile and turn it, make it, gather all the materials. It's like quite the endeavor, but in community, many hands make light work. And I think Calgary's community gardens can be a bit individualistic. Like everybody's just got their little plot, and you show up there whenever it's up to you, and maybe that's a good part of it, and that's why some people like it. But I think there's potential to maybe put a sign out, or somehow get in touch with the other members and say, like, on a Wednesday evening, let's meet here and discuss making a compost pile in 2 weeks, and who can go get the coffee grounds, and who can go get the mesh from from Tish and Colin. And I think there is some planning that needs to go into it. So I would say find friends and people, like community, and we've seen it builds community when you do this. Takes a bit of effort to like connect with people and schedule it and show up at the time, but I would say it's definitely guaranteed to be worth it if you can gather people and the resources together, and it's quite inspiring. So I would say, yeah, if you live in an apartment, maybe you don't have the vehicle to do the picking up of stuff, but like maybe you can make the sign, or maybe you can call your
Get the coffee.
neighbor.
Coffee's easy.
Yeah, I don't know. There's different roles for people to play, kind of like the different characters in the compost pile.
Oh, I love it. So the soil itself inspires community building.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, all right, gather my allies, amass my tools, and keep the hope stoked. I was really impressed when you're listing the browns and greens, the sources. So I saw meat in there. We talked about blood meal and bone meal. There's a question that came through about chopping up real Christmas trees. So I think we hear so many different sources because there's different ways of composting. Like the city will say put this in or don't put that in. A passive pile can only take certain things. So is it true? Can we really put those items in our compost? So that would be hot composting, right? If we're putting meat and meal and that type of thing in.
We still don't recommend the meat until you've made a couple piles, because you don't want to have a failed pile and stuff, like, I don't know,
Lots of
whatever.
other animals coming to check out your pile.
Okay.
But
low key.
Yeah.
But the Christmas tree question, yes, you can. I would just say that's where you can't just like chop it up into like you need to chip it up, and in order to do that, you'd have to have a wood chipper. And for most, chippers that most people have in their backyard, they're for like small branches, not a whole Christmas tree. But if you have the ability to somehow chip up your Christmas tree 100%, you could do that. We do notice that the pine needle, we try to avoid a lot, not 0 pine needles, but we try to avoid a large amount of pine needles because they are pretty persistent. They do break down and eventually, but they'll be around for a long time. So when we're selecting wood chips at Highfield, they have massive piles, and arborists just drop off, this tree here and this. We try to avoid taking all the pine needles.
Yeah, because they're very antimicrobial, like the oils on the pine needles. You can smell the smell of a tree, right? It's it's not good for creating a lot of microbes in your pile. Maybe if you were to soak them or they're to be aged needles, then it's not as big of a deal.
I was looking for the name. So GS, who asked the question, maybe if the Christmas tree is still alive, it's ready to drop all those needles. So you could shake it on the ground a couple times, get rid of the needles, and then chip it. And then in your presentation, you mentioned coniferous mulch has more nitrogen than deciduous, or I might have that the other way around. So you'd have to refer to some guide on that, or
this is a note on the leaves.
Carbon.
Yeah. So essentially, you can think of nitrogen as synonymous with chlorophyll, somewhat. Green is chlorophyll in plants, and that essentially equals your nitrogen. So green leaves, like you cut down a branch and you strip off those leaves in the middle of summer, those would be a nitrogen source. But in the fall, when trees start to go dormant, they take all that nitrogen and put it into their roots, and that's why the leaves go from green to brown. The chlorophyll essentially is taken away, and then there's no those wouldn't be a nitrogen source.
They'd be carbon.
Yeah, they would be a woody material or a brown. But when it comes to deciduous versus coniferous, generally trees in general would just be a brown. Like if you just took a tree and chipped it, you wouldn't really consider it green at all. Maybe if it was, a lot of branches but still mostly carbon.
Yeah, because there wouldn't be chlorophyll in the bark.
Yeah, like the majority of the percentage of the tree by weight would be mostly carbon.
And if you really want to get nerdy and kind of know which wood is more carbon or nitrogen, you can Google it online, and lots of like Cornell University, they have a good listing of how much carbon and nitrogen is in different.
And generally, fungi like hardwoods, or more fungi like hardwoods than softwoods. Though there's lots of fungi that like softwoods, anyway. You can open up a whole can of worms looking into these things, but what I would encourage is just start with one compost pile. Don't think too much about the recipe. Just have those general 10% high nitrogen, 30% greens, 60% woody. You'll probably be doing pretty good, and you'll get it to heat up, and you'll be inspired to be like, I can do it even different or better next time, and do it with other people, so you don't get too exhausted.
So you can build on your sophistication. I guess that's probably why I love gardening and composting, is because there's many entry points. It doesn't matter where you start or what your knowledge is to begin with. You can always grow. From there, you'll grow. So, in thinking about setting up a new pile, it seems like unless it's a passive pile where you're not you're just layering your greens and your browns, your sources of nitrogen and carbon. It seems like the temperature is something you really have to pay attention to. The temperature, and are there any other things that a new to composting person would need to really look at when they're doing hot composting?
I think it depends what you're putting in. If you're putting in weed seeds and you're maybe worried about pathogens, maybe you did put in some manure or something, then you'll definitely want it to be over 55. But with a lot of the piles that we've been making, especially at communities and that, we were kind of nervous maybe to start out with putting weeds in right away, so we don't put them in. So then I used to be really uptight about always hitting the 55, and we'd have conversations about this. But really, if you're getting over 45, 50, that is still going to be killing a lot of pathogens, and you don't have the weed seeds, so then you wouldn't have to worry. And then we've always had a discussion. Sometimes it's hard to make a choice. So I think I'm going off topic, but sometimes it's hard to make a choice about whether you want to hit your heating cycle and wait, or whether, oh no, this is smelling really bad, do we turn it now? And,
So where you need to think about the neighboring property, people wandering into the community
Yeah.
association.
And I used to be really focused on the temperature. And I'd be like, no, it hasn't been this many hours. And Colin would be like, well, we got to turn it.
And when this is happening, the smells aren't like really bad, like, you know,
Yeah.
smoking out the neighborhood. It's just like you can start to smell a bit of ammonia and things that are signals of low to anaerobic conditions. And so from my perspective, it's better to not go anaerobic and not have, like, if you're starting to smell those, turn it, even if you haven't hit your temperature threshold, because when it goes anaerobic, bad
Then you get pathogens.
Yeah, you're essentially.
What do you do then? If you just have like a stinky, drippy
turn it
pile, and then so just keep turning it.
That's my argument.
Have you ever had a pile go bad?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and I mean, even here, it depends on the time of year. Summertime, if you want your first pile, make it in July. It's like, it's going to happen.
It's full
magic.
Yeah.
But as soon as you get on your shoulder seasons, then it gets more and more difficult.
That's a great point.
And like the one that we did here at the Alex, it did go stinky, and it was in a smaller enclosed.
We did it in October or
November.
And we were in a somewhat enclosed space.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
wind blowing through.
And then we were worried about it heating up, so we put a lot of nitrogen in, because in our course they say, you know, maybe you should go with 20% nitrogen. So we put a lot in. I think it was actually 25. I can't remember exactly. But then that also made it go, like, all the bacteria started happening, and then it did start to go anaerobic because it was too much party happening.
Too much party.
But not if the heat wasn't still happening. So then,
yeah. That's a good point about the shoulder seasons. So if you're doing this in community and you want to do your first pile, start talking about it in April and May, but wait until June or July to do it, because there's, you know, if it's cold outside and there's not a lot of actual microbial activity just happening in nature, like there is definitely some happening, but you know, you want an abundance of microbes, and you also want the temperature to be warm enough that things can just get started. And so that's where June and July, I guess the shoulder season, what slows down piles is the nighttime temperature. So it might be nice during the day, but if it gets down to 1 or 2, all those microbes,
they're like humans.
We're not gonna, yeah.
If we don't want to do anything, chances are the microbes don't want to do anything either.
Yeah. So like you said, it's almost foolproof in the middle of summer. Warm nights, warm days, things, and your abundance of materials also. Like, to get all those greens that we talked about, you want to do, like, start your garden, having weeds to pull. Once you have that first, like, big weed pull, that's the time to make your pile.
Okay. So follow the season.
Follow the season. Yeah. Don't try to make compost in the winter. It won't work.
So in reference to our pile that we have outside here at the Alex, inside at the Alex here, Rosie, we named it Rosie.
Always name your piles. That's another tip.
When Rosie's finished, so Rosie is a 50 bucket pile. Once we kind of added a couple things.
Yeah, I think we almost got up to 60 maybe, but yeah.
So she's a big pile. How much land will that cover? Like, when you're thinking in terms of applying it, and this question comes from our live audience. So props to our live audience, you guys, coming out to listen to gardening talk in January. How would you disperse that?
I think you have a better answer than I.
I think it helps if you do have access to a microscope or somebody that does, and you can look and see how if you have a lot of microbes there, or if you don't. Because in theory, if you have a lot of good compost, you don't need that much. You might just need like a quarter inch to an inch and then, you know, mix it in a little bit just on the surface.
Okay.
That's what's great compost. And
That's
then
thinking about it as an inoculant rather than organic
or you
matter.
can put it in, like, when you're planting your seeds, to make sure it's right by the seeds. It depends too. Like, you can make compost extract, which is really easy because you don't even have to. In our soil food web school, they call extract is just when you take a mesh bag and you put a few handfuls of compost in it, and then you just dunk it in a bucket and you massage it, and the water will kind of turn like a nice brown color. And so you can put your seeds before you plant them, inoculate them in the water, get the enzymes and the microbes on them. So then you don't need very much compost for that if you're making extracts. Or a tea. A tea, in the way that we've learned it in our school, a tea is when you add food, like maybe you add molasses to get more bacteria, or you add some fish hydrolysate or kelp for the fungi to start getting that going more. So it kind of depends.
The answer is it depends.
Yeah.
But if you have, and it also depends on your soil. If this is your garden where you think your soil is like pretty good but needs a little extra, then you probably don't need much. That's more the inoculant thinking. But if it's like bone dry and like dead and nothing's been growing there for a while, you should probably put a lot.
Thicker layer.
Yeah. And then it's also the soil health principles too. Like make sure you cover it
after and
with
keep it
mulch
moist,
or something
and you
after.
try to have different seeds and plants that you're planting in there to, ideally you want a lot of diversity in growing in that soil. So yeah, it depends. If it's like your vegetable garden and you're just trying to recharge it and like inoculate it, that's where the teas and the extracts, you can, like a handful of compost can water, like do one drench or spray of your garden, and that's getting the microbes in there. And if there's already plants and organic matter living in there, then they'll kind of multiply. But if it's dead, then you probably want the compost for the microbes and the organic matter, which is kind of the double benefit of good compost.
I think in listening to you guys talk tonight, it helped in the beginning when you had us imagine that we're these different single-celled organisms, like pretending like, what are we hungry for? What are we seeing? What's life like as a cilia? And then now to think, okay, when our compost pile is finished, it's still a living thing. It's just this thing that you could broadcast or steep, or spread around or pile up, but to keep it covered. So you wouldn't just sort of toss this living thing out there and be like, all right, thanks so much.
Yeah.
Right? You'd keep it covered, you'd protect it, you'd keep giving it the things of life like air, water.
A home. Yeah.
Yes, love. Kelly asked, and I think you kind of answered it, probably it's that depends answer, but when is the pile ready to use? So let's say we don't have a microscope, and we've got 5 minutes left, so let's see if we can answer that. How would a regular community gardener know when a pile is finished?
Well, the answer is it depends, but definitely when it's hot anymore. So you're that's
so
bare minimum.
So you can tell by touch, by sensory.
It's not even technically ready then. That's just the end of the bacterial and thermophilic cycle. But best case scenario, 6 months of letting the fungi kind of then go and eat the wood chips. But we have a winter here, and if you just leave that pile there over the winter, it's not that bad for it. Not everything doesn't die, but
just goes dormant.
You want to get it on. So you want, ideally, like compost. The best time to apply compost is the spring and the fall, and the best time to make it is in the summer. So ideally, you make it in the summer, and it finishes its thermophilic cycle in say 2 weeks. Is usually kind of, if it all goes well, and then let it mature. Keep it moist for ideally as long as possible, until you're kind of putting your garden to bed for the winter, and then you put those microbes or the compost on the soil, and then mulch it and let it sit for the winter. And I've heard a quote that the most diverse place is in between the surface of the soil and underneath the snow is where the most microbial life is.
Yeah.
So
that's promising.
Yeah.
With the heating and thawing.
Because it's 0 degrees there, technically, it should be, unless it's like minus 35 out, then it's like, but in a normal temperature gradient, the surface of the soil is 0. And if you have put that compost on and mulched and there's snow on top, it's doing wonderful things that will benefit you the following season.
Awesome. So that speaks. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, sorry. So it could be as soon as 3 months.
Yeah, right.
But it's better if you
get more of an answer.
6 months and a little bit beyond is better.
Yeah,
Okay.
and you could do it
To a
like
year.
a month after, but And another, we actually seen good results. Just to caveat, somebody said plants like stinky stuff, especially vegetables or like leafy greens. They don't want a lot of the fungi. They want the bacteria. So immature, or like once it's done the thermophilic cycle, it's actually okay in certain instances to use it pretty much right away.
Okay.
And we've actually seen good results for, in some of our trials that we've done where, our older piles didn't do well with vegetables. They probably were better for shrubs and trees and like those sort of situations where vegetables actually want the more bacterial than fungal. So
it depends what you're using your pile for anyway.
Yeah.
That's good to know.
Yeah.
It sounds to me like it's always good to have two piles going. So one you're going to use and apply, and one you're going to be maturing, returning, loving, actively loving.
Yeah.
We're coming to a close, and I appreciate your time so much. And I feel like I just keep wanting to say, like, just call Ghostbusters, which is like Calgary Compost Cooperative. So you need like a 1-800-GHOSTBUSTERS number. But I think the hello
100 got soil.
Hello, we put the email in the chat, hello@compostclub.ca. Seems like a great entry point for people that want to continue learning with you, rubbing elbows with other compost folks, and really becoming good stewards of the land. Any last parting words or any encouragement you have for our audience, both here and online?
I'd say Tish has been doing lots of school workshops. So that's if you have a school that wants to learn more about this.
It's nice, all ages.
All
ages.
ages. Yeah. We're not doing Compost Club at Highfield right now, but we plan on doing it again this summer. So stay tuned for that. And then if you want to do this at your community garden, we're more than happy to help, and we can hook you up with buckets and the mesh and answer questions. And we highly encourage you to start your own compost club or compost pile in your own backyard or somewhere. Do you have anything to add?
No, I think that about covers it.
Well, I want to thank you again for being here, and just a little last minute plug for the cooperative. We found it so luxurious to have you hold our hands the whole way, and we weren't second guessing anything when we were creating Rosie, and now we have this beautiful living thing that we can use in the gardens here at the Alex Community Food Center. So hopefully that will inspire and encourage everyone beyond. So thanks again, and thank you everyone for tuning in. We hope this is good encouragement for you to start researching and planning, getting your compost group together and meeting some more people to help build the soil in your space. And thank you to everyone who came out tonight and joined us for the evening. Stay in touch through the Calgary Horticultural Society. We've got lots of stuff on our What's Happening page. And thanks again. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.